Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the president and the founder of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Today, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Charles Tenenbaum. Charles, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Paul. It's a pleasure. I'm delighted too.
Well, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. For the benefit of our listeners, I'll just spend a few moments on your background. Charles is an associate professor in political science at Sciences Po in Lille, where he directs the Conflicts and Development program. His work spans international mediation, conflict resolution, the sociology of conflict, the role of international organizations, and religion in international relations. And he's just returned from some time in Cairo working on conflict resolution training. He's also the author of International Mediation and the co-editor of the European Union and Peace, and he regularly consults with the United Nations on matters relating to inclusive peace building. Charles is also a valued colleague, and we have had the privilege of working together on an independent working group advising President Zelensky and his team on the Ukrainian peace process. Charles, so excited to have this conversation with you.
Well, thank you very much again, Paul. It's been a while. We'll be discussing the possibility to have this exchange, and it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to dig into questions and topics of shared interest today.
Well, Charles, as we dig in, it's always helpful for our thousands of listeners to have a sense of your background, your motivation, your inspiration. And so tell us a little bit about your journey to basically, a deeply respected and highly engaged intellectual who deals with and thinks about management of conflicts. Is this something you aspired to do when you were in middle school and high school and grow up and be a peace builder? Or was there something along your career trajectory that caused you to pivot into the study and the practice of peace building?
Well, thank you very much for asking our questions. As a matter of fact, no. In high school and in my young years, I was not dreaming on working on mediation, peace building, conflict resolution. I think one of the most marking moments was my participation to a summer school in the University of Kent, at Canterbury, at the start of my PhD years, where I had the chance to discuss, exchange, encounter some scholars, some highly valued scholars like Professor Chris Mitchell and others around him like John Groom, who had themselves been involved for many years, not only in the in an academic interest towards peace research and conflict resolution, but also had committed themselves to try to make it work. And they had been at the foundation with others, of course, of the model of problem-solving workshop. Also, I think, well, I was thinking about your questions about the background and my own interest, because, of course, one can always look at the academic interest and the development of the academic interest, but also the how personally you come to be interested in that field. I think, I was a teenager at a time during the 90s and the 90 decade. At a time from where I was, I was already in France. I grew up in Burgundy. From where I was, it appeared possible for a certain number of conflicts suddenly to find their way through some kind of management, some kind of compromise, maybe some kind of conflict resolution processes. And I remember, for instance, in 1993, attending in Paris a great event that I was very impressed of, when Israeli and Palestinian leaders were having a shared talk at UNESCO here in Paris, drawing the perspectives for economic cooperation and renewed negotiation. Of course, this is where we live today in a very different period of time, but I think that might have played a role also in my interest towards international relations and studying conflicts and then conflict resolution.
So thinking about it, but then seeing it happen in real time around you caused you to develop this dual-hatted approach to thinking, studying, and then practicing and training.
Yeah, and then when I was at Sciences Po here, I was at the time I was hesitating between trying to enter the diplomatic career and going through research. So I had a chance to have several discussions with my PhD supervisor, who said, well, why not look into mediation and how, what exists in terms of mediation studies? And at the time, in France, of course, French diplomacy had always the job that diplomats do, being engaged in good offices, etc. But in terms of academic departments, in terms of expertise, there was very little, and in some places, quite nothing on those questions. And I had the chance to spend a year in the US studying that at which is now called, I think, Carter School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. And when I came back, it was a possibility for me to actually develop research into the field of mediation, and also to create at Sciences Po here in Paris the first class on international mediation and conflict resolution that I've been teaching since. On top of my teaching at Sciences Po Lille, I've been teaching that in Paris for a number of years.
Well, Charles, let's pick up on your reference to French diplomacy, because I want to get your thoughts on how France is framing and responding to and engaging in this paradigm shift from a multipolar, bipolar, unipolar, whatever we wanted to call it, whatever's coming next. And specifically, since France has played such a crucial role in establishing and operating the current world order, permanent member on the Security Council since its inception, one of the founding members of the European Union. And even within the European Union, there's oftentimes referred to this as the E3, with France being one of those three. And then France being deeply committed to, for various reasons, multilateralism around the globe. What is your perception of how France is responding to the shifting world order and the open threat to a rules-based order?
Yeah. Well, allow me to, maybe to get back to a little bit of history and say that, of course, it's a key element that France since 1945 had a seat at the UN Security Council, which, by the way, when we look at it from now, people could discuss, what kind of power is France to have had this seat at the UN Security Council. But I think that, of course, played a very important role in France's position on the international scene. And also, as you just said, its commitment from the very start to engage in reconciliation process with neighboring Germany through the European committees and the European Union. But of course, and all that played in France becoming an important actor and promoter of the importance of norms and rules and principles governing the international world order. But also it's worth reminding that France is also a nuclear power, and which allows it to play on different levels, both on the peace and security side, but also on the peacemaking side, on the normative side of international relations, but also on the key question of security in the international chessboard. And I think if I would go even back in history, I think there is a kind of legacy also from the early years of the 19th century and the post-First World War. Individuals like and great politicians like Aristide Briand or Léon Bourgeois that played a role already at the Hague conferences in 1899 and 1907, and then in the interwar in between the two world wars, that also created, I think, a kind of the interest or a kind of commitment of France's international policy strategy to remain involved in international affairs. I'm not sure I've actually responded to your question, by the way.
No, Charles, that really helps to tee up a couple of other questions that I have. Given France's sort of operating as a cornerstone of the world order, the rules-based order, and given its political power, Security Council, political power within the EU, military power being nuclear, and having one of the best resourced and trained militaries. Now that you're faced with this erosion of the rules-based order, and President Macron, when he was in the Davos, the World Economic Forum, talked about international law being trampled underfoot. Now, us international lawyers, we always like it when we get a shout out, even if it's everyone's trampling on your principles and the rules that you seek to promote. He called it out for what it was, and then recently in Seoul, he talked about needing to actively build a new order that reflects strategic autonomy and not being subservient to any one particular power, meaning the United States. How is that vision shaping up in
Yeah, he recently had that, and I think it was in one of those event problems in civil, but then he repeated it several times. He had that saying, "If one wants to be powerful, one must be feared," and it can appear quite, and especially since from maybe the United States or other places of power, quite interesting to say the least, to say France opting for this kind of formulation. Well, in 2018, a couple of years back, when President Macron gathered during the annual meeting of the ambassadors, the ambassadors' annual meeting where they get the general instructions from the president, he encouraged them to embody France that would be a mediating power. Yeah. So there is always this concern and this ambition and commitment to appear as a power that determines or has a key role in the world order. But we have been probably trying different approaches to that. On the world-based order, being an intermediary power at the time where great powers, including the US, were retracting from multilateralism, and now also investing or committing to more resources being invested in the security apparatus and security strategy for Europe. Yeah.
Charles, let's explore that a little bit further. Is your sense that France has developed a coherent response to the changing global order, or is France casting about, like many other countries, trying to figure out whether it's strategic autonomy, whether it's a coalition of the quote, willing and able countries? Is there a clear plan that France is beginning to implement, or whoa, this took us and everybody else by surprise, and they're trying on different responses to the evolving global order?
I would say maybe on three different points here that I think of our interest. I think on the principles, on the model, it appears quite coherent, sticking to the importance of a world-based world order, maybe presenting in different ways that get also, it doesn't convey any misunderstanding with partners when, even the expression of world-based order, but sticking to multilateralism, the role of international cooperation, and the role of negotiated agreements on as many issues as possible. And at the same time, staying very much present on the security side of international relations, developing a clear deterrence strategy. So I think that this is quite a recurrent strategy for France. But then the second aspect is the implementation of that strategy. Yeah. The implementation of that strategy, the political constraints that exist, the budgetary constraints that exist, and maybe the possibility to actually create coalitions, to actually engage partners and allies in this strategy. France, presidents, to say it simply like to present themselves as leading initiatives at the international relations. Maybe sometime, boxing a little bit, appearing at least as boxing a bit out of our category. But behind that is the idea that France would assume the leadership, including at the multilateral and several initiatives. And I think we mentioned a little bit of them already. So I think on these three points, there is a coherent view and narrative strategy. But on the implementation phase, internal political contracts, resources, and capacity to engage others and to build trusted relationship with partners and allies, this is still raising quite a few questions.
Well, Charles, let's take that assessment and apply it to Ukraine. One of what I have found very positive dimensions of France's response to Russia's war of aggression against Europe and Ukraine is that President Macron came right out, declares that Russia's war of aggression is an existential threat to Europe and to France, and has been very active leading along with a couple of others, the coalition within the European Union to support Ukraine and to push back on Russia. And at the same time, France is positioning itself partly as a mediator or as a backup mediator, also willing, along with the British, to provide troops for guaranteeing a peace process. How can you unpack for us a little bit an understanding of why the French have such clarity when, quite frankly, many other European countries don't have clarity on the degree to which Russia's war of aggression is an existential threat? Where does that come from in France? And then what is France's strategic thinking on where it's positioned itself in the effort to push back on the Russians and also mediate and enforce/implement any peace agreement?
Well, because this is a complex question, I think that the positioning has actually evolved since the war of Ukraine started back in early 2022. And at that time, I think probably the French president still had in mind how his predecessor, one of his predecessors, President Sarkozy, had mediated the 6 points agreement between Russia and Georgia in the summer of 2008, at the time of the Beijing Olympics, where if a couple of hours, maybe a few days of shuttle diplomacy from the French president, actually at the time acting European Union president, managed to not to solve the conflict, of course, but at least to freeze the conflict and to stop the violence. So we've seen attempts at the start of the war to play that, to engage in diplomacy. And as we've seen it quite recently, also 2 or 3 months ago, President Macron sent a few of his advisors to Moscow to offer to renew negotiations, an offer that was clearly rejected by the Russian counterpart. So they still, as you've said, you're right to say that there is still this in the background, this belief that France can play a role in a negotiated outcome. So, but then, of course, support to Russia has been seen since 2022 as a growing threat on different level, and on the Ukraine military issue there, of course, but on many other, from meddling into internal affairs to representing future threats in the coming years. So France, as you said, has been leading initiatives at the European level in terms of sanction packages, in terms of military support to Ukraine. And I think there's, it's again not that incoherent in terms of strategy to be open, at least in the narrative, to be open to negotiation when the time will come, and at the same time to be very firm on the what is understood view from Paris as the security of Europe in the coming years. Then, of course, seen from other capitals, especially, I guess, from Washington, D.C., France appeared not at the moment to be in the center of any negotiated attempt when negotiations are attempted, to be in the position more to react than to be at the one that initiates political dynamics, and to try to actually see where in the US strategy it could still get some influence and try to steer here and there the dynamic engaged by American and President Trump foreign policy strategy. So that has put France in a difficult situation, and has been engaging France to explicitly wonder in what was the nature of its alliance and its proximity to the United States, and especially, and doubting of to what extent they were still sharing the same views on the war of Ukraine.
Well, Charles, one of the splits between the Americans and a little bit the French, but mostly the Americans and the Europeans, is the degree to which the Europeans spend or don't spend on their militaries, on armament, on rearmament. Now, France and the Brits have always been ahead of the pack, but there has been quite a bit of momentum recently, or at least a lot of talk about the Germans moving up towards 5%, other countries moving up towards 5%. And France has been very clear. They have a highly effective military. As you mentioned earlier, they have the nuclear deterrent, and Macron has talked about extending that nuclear umbrella to some of the other states in NATO and in the European Union. But quietly, on the French perspective, is there a serious possibility of the European Union member states becoming responsible for their own defense and doing those things that are necessary to integrate? And I have in my mind, at the moment, there's a dispute between the French and the Germans on the 6th-generation fighter, Airbus and Dassault. There's also a dispute between the Germans and another European country or two on some frigates that they're supposed to be building. And so two major dimensions of the military, sixth generation fighter, modern frigates are gridlocked, partly because of who gets what piece of the pie. And so is it happy talk to say that the Europeans are going to boost their expenditures to 5%? They're going to integrate the production and the operation, and they don't really need the Americans, which I think some of the Americans would be happy with that happy talk. Or is this kind of dangerous? The Ukraine-Russian war against Ukraine has been going on for 4 years now. It's now Europe's war, people will say. The Americans are busy in Iran and in other places. Is Europe able to defend the European continent?
Well, if I may, I think I remember you saying that the Americans might be dealing with the negotiation process when it will happen, but then we hand it out to the Europeans for them to deal with it. And if that's the case, then it's key for the Europeans, and especially for countries like France, Germany, the UK, Italy, those countries that true military capabilities today and projection military capabilities to be able to assume this position. And it is in this context that we can also understand the recent speeches from President Macron on the dissuasion avancée, the advanced deterrent theory, on the coalition of the willing, with those calls to 34 countries. So really trying to build up a narrative, a strategy at the European Union level that will help reinforce a Paris military strategy and have a coherent work at the collective level. So I think again we are at a point where those questions are on the table. There are several initiatives. There are different scenarios. Will that advanced deterrence capacity be actually implemented not only for France's sole national strategy, but also in cooperation with neighboring nations? Will European Union countries think that the French nuclear umbrella protection offer is credible and is also pertinent in the context of the evolving transatlantic relationship? I think those questions are actually on the table today, and we won't have clear answer at least before between 2 and 5 upcoming years, depending also on electoral milestones coming up. So to answer your question, actually, is it a good thing? I think the scenario where the European Union, France, neighboring countries can gear up in terms of a defense autonomy, autonomic strategy in terms of security issues at the continental level is good if at the same time the alliance, the transatlantic alliance, especially for NATO, is still maintained, still credible, and still able to show how contemporary threats and future threats can be confronted at the collective level, like together in a trusted way. That would be the good scenario, in my understanding.
So collective security with NATO as a cornerstone, but the European military forces being more capable of contributing to that deterrent or to the actual use of force. Well, let's shift to a space where the Americans are not present, the European Union. I think with NATO, the European states, for some reason, seem to have been taken a little bit by surprise, not the French or the British or the Italians, but the others, about the need to up their game, so to speak, in the military space. But in the political space, the economic space, the legal order space, the European Union has been functioning for decades. And there's a bit of a spotlight on the European Union now because there's, with the various, is this going to be unipolar or bipolar or regional? One of the only, if not the only, highly effective regional bloc is the European Union. Is it poised and is it capable, if the new world structure is multi-regional, to step into that space? Or, it seems to be at a point in time where it's not entirely sure. Is it economic? Is it political? And now they're even talking about, I think it's Article 42, how the European Union would respond in a military capacity if Ukraine was brought in as a member of the European Union, or things along those lines, absent a NATO defense umbrella. Is the European Union well poised to be a regional actor on the global stage? Or, not so much?
What I would say, it actually is a key regional actor already in many aspects, in many areas that, until recently we're not entirely focusing on security and strategic issue or strategic autonomy and defense, but on development, on on the economy, on the exchanges, including on civilian mission of peace building initiatives, and also on funding those initiatives in many areas in the world. France, the European Union is a key actor. And at the same time, it is today faced with a number of questions that were not answered not 10 years ago, not 20 years ago, not 30 years ago. Do we build kind of from questions that go from the existence of European citizenship and a real European political identity, and which touches on the question of development of the European Union, opening to integrating new countries. And we are right at the moment at this debate again, I would say, regarding Ukraine, and the possibility of a fast-paced integration of Ukraine within the European Union. So from that question on the political and identity side, the question of are European Union countries ready to build their own security strategy, build their own security industry, and not being over dependent on American weapons, to say it very quickly. And on that question, clearly today, it's not at 27 EU members, it's not in position to assume those questions, so to respond positively to those questions. Hence, I think an interesting debate about a multi-level European Union. There was suggestions of creating a kind of EU Security Council that would mirror a kind of UN Security Council of key powers in the European Union, the same way we have within the European Union countries that have adopted the EU currency and those that have not. So maybe a more flexible approach to the European Union, which integration and enlargement process, which would enable the European Union to remain a very attractive political entity. And this is actually the strategy that is being followed by President Macron, which puts on the forefront of his discourses the stability, the predictability, the rule-based political environment. And by the way, it makes me think of something of an anecdote, but maybe you've seen that there's the French Minister of Foreign Affairs has created a couple of months ago a Twitter account dedicated to responding to US declaration called the French response. And it's quite funny, but it is also on those questions, like trying to also give more publicity, promoting the advantages that the European Union and its countries might represent. Yeah.
Yeah. So the foreign minister is right up there with Kim Kardashian as a Twitter influencer. I had translated some of his tweets.
Yeah.
He's pretty spicy, pretty edgy,
Yeah.
Especially for a French foreign minister. Charles, let's unpack a little bit more the opinion. You mentioned flexibility. And you and I have both been in public spaces where there's a lot of ideas, especially with Ukraine, about membership, reversing first the membership and then the utilizing the membership as a way of restructuring rule of law and other things within Ukraine. There's talk about second track, but then when you go to Brussels, there doesn't seem to be a lot of appetite for flexibility. Are you hopeful that, vis-a-vis Ukraine, but also vis-a-vis, the burden that the French, the Germans, and the Italians carry economically and politically and otherwise within the European Union, and this sort of informal E3 that they've developed? Do you have a sense that Europe is ready to be flexible in terms of the operation of the European Union and in terms of the way it brings in new members?
Well, you're right. And at the moment, I would respond negatively to your question. At the moment, there's more of a sense of maybe not dragging feet, but at least not making it easier for the Ukrainians to enter the European Union. I think here it is really the need for realization by European Union, maybe historical founding members and others that have added to the European Union model in the past decades to really realize how the perspective of integrating countries that are turning toward the European Union is not only a question of of the economy, of the capacity really to abide by those 35 chapters of the acquis that are called are supposed to be negotiated, but actually are a body of rules and regulation from the European Union have to be put in place by the candidates to integration within the European Union, which is very good. But at the same time, there is such a strong interest, strategic interest for the European Union to appear as still being attractive enough. So for those countries to turn towards the European Union and not towards other powers today, that really we should find ways to make it easier or find ways to make it more flexible to join one way or another the European Union, maybe at different levels, maybe, through but with clear symbolic milestones where countries and the society within those countries. Because at the end, in Brussels, I think it is key to remember, as always in international relations, that we have a group of individuals that are taking decisions, that are going through negotiations, taking decisions, the responsibility for those decisions. Sometimes they're taking the risk of those decisions, and that are talking, and that those decisions have consequences and are impacting societies, public opinions, and narratives. And we should really, realize how important an existing narrative that is in favor of the European political dynamic, and to save it or to make it becoming a political reality.
So you're hopeful there might be some flexibility in order to continue to sustain the European project.
I'm moderately hopeful, but I think this would be a good strategy to go ahead. I think we still, we can remember how it went with debates on the possibility to integrate Turkey within the European Union. And maybe it was not the right time. Maybe it would have been extremely difficult actually to integrate such a big country and a powerful country like Turkey. But the fact of closing the door so explicitly to Turkey has had a tremendous impact in the years after, or contributing to favoring certain type of scenario or the other types of scenario. And we should be, as Europeans and European leaders should, I think, be wary of the risks that go with, making countries understand that they might not be ready for years and years to come to integrate the European Union. So maybe, moderately hopeful, but thinking that we should absolutely find ways to have a model of association, close political cooperation, and integration that preserves the European media model as a working one and functional peace system. Yeah.
Well, Charles, let's pivot away from the European Union and to other parts of the world, the global South. Oftentimes in the conversations relating to this evolving paradigm shift, there's quite a bit of enthusiasm for finally constructively engaging states that may be self-identified or otherwise as the global South. I've come to realize nobody actually likes that term, especially countries in the global South. There are middle powers, rising powers, aspiring powers, but let's just say places outside of North America and Europe. How is France approaching that? The Canadians basically cut loose the global South. The Prime Minister of Canada said, well, we need a coalition of the middle powers, and made no reference whatsoever to the global South in his Davos presentations. Others have talked about the South Africans more of a coalition. There's the BRICS, which is a little bit the Russians and the Chinese trying to do a global South coalition. Is France interested in aligning itself and bringing the global South states into the conversation? France has had some difficulty recently in West Africa with Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and having the military peacekeeping troops asked to leave as a result of the coups in those countries. There's the legacy of colonialism. France has dealt with that in a particular way with economic integration. What does the conversation regarding the global South look like and sound like in France? And is it changing?
Well, I would say that, yes, France has a strong interest in maintaining or establishing alliances and partnerships and with those countries of the global South. You mentioned West Africa, and here, of course, the past decade has been a decade of disillusionment for France, especially in those countries where France had strong cooperation accords, sometimes had also, military accords. And I remember being, in Mali, where we see these very days very strong, and violent clashes between government forces, and you had these groups happening again. I was in Mali in 2013, just 3 weeks before the French military intervention after sanctions approved by the UN Security Council. And at the time, French operations and French political leadership, it was a very positive approach. I remember that there were a demonstration in the streets with people wearing those African panniers with the name of French President François Hollande, etc. And 10 years later, France gets kicked out of Mali and has been put also in a difficult situation in other countries in the region. And this amounted to, misunderstandings also from the part of France of misreading the evolution of the situation there. So probably we're still, I think, at a time where we need to go beyond the legacy of the past, to find ways to go beyond the legacy of colonialism. This is also in a very different way, also the case with our relationship with Algeria. And I guess that after that kind of turning point, France will still try to reach out as being a partner within probably more kind of a multilateral setting than a multiplication of bilateral agreements. But it is true to say that in West Africa and in the region today, France has been going through a difficult period of time. And regarding Global South, you were mentioning at the start of our discussion at the meeting in Seoul, and there we see France trying to promote the idea of a kind of middle powers alliances, this kind of power that would play an intermediary role between the big powers and the smaller one. It's an interesting initiative. I'm not entirely convinced that it can go beyond, this kind of zones of influence or very important power dynamics in the contemporary international chessboard. But in the part of France, it appears, as you say, as the willingness to create alternative options for those countries that don't want to be entirely dependent on the big powers. And there might at least be areas for cooperation in that regard.
Well, Charles, I'm a little curious now. How does France describe itself? Superpower? At one point in time, it was like America's the hyperpower, which left space for this France to be a superpower. When you and I were together in Japan, the Japanese described themselves as an important power. They weren't a middle power; they were an important power. Has France settled on a term, or doesn't the French don't really think about categorizing the status of their power? They're just France.
That will suffice. Well, I still think that France sees itself as being a grande puissance. The legacy dating from the General de Gaulle to many other political leaders have still understood France as playing, a grande puissance, and we could think in terms of strategy or grand strategy here, as being able to be present in many different aspects or dimensions of contemporary international relations, not being clearly absent of any key, balls of the contemporary international relations. Of course, might seem a little bit a very modest approach to international relations, quite an ambition or an ambitious approach, and not always in line with our true capacity compared with other great powers. The also economic resources at times of crisis, and there has always been the debate: are we a middle power? Are we great powers? So I think in terms of understanding, in terms of position, in terms of narrative, grande puissance still applies.
So, Charles, does that apply to artificial intelligence? Because one of the evolutions that you and I have talked about, and I have to, for our audience, I have to say over Burgundy wine, because I made the mistake at dinner with you once of trying to order Bordeaux, and you were having none of that. But we had a long conversation about artificial intelligence and how basically the Americans and the Chinese seem to be the two top dogs occupying that space. And then even within the United States, it's frontier labs, that private sector, that are occupying that space and not yet self-aware of their sovereign capabilities, but having some pretty serious impacts around the globe. And you and I talked a little bit about how France was trying to nudge its way into that top tier of countries that have embraced and are funding and are innovating in artificial intelligence. Is France going to have a place in AI in the same way that it has a place in other arenas in the global infrastructure?
Yeah, I think here again is a good illustration because, of course, as you said, the very big players are based in the United States. But France here has been both investing itself in developing a national AI strategy. I think with more than approximately 2.5 billion euros. That might be not as nothing compared to a very big budget at the global level, but still with an AI strategy and developing its own AI tools, national tools, sovereign tools. Because here, France is very aware and has been developing a discourse here on the necessity to preserve AI sovereignty. So there is those tools, including the one that's called Mistral, le chat, to the cat, but le chat also says, like Chat GPT is the chat. But I think that probably is going to be difficult to keep it, to keep the pace in terms of development that say big US companies are engaging in terms of AI competition and competitive strategy. So France has also been involved in trying to bring forward the need for regulation. And here again, we find, where France cannot be and might not have the similar resources as the United States or the important actors like China, it pushes an agenda for regulation, and especially through the European Union. And in that regards, it has been interesting to see that on some aspects, on some questions, big AI firms or computing firms have been in certain way obliged to abide by the European rules, or at least to come here and justify sometime to pay for compensations, etc. So that's something to take into account. There is a possibility here to have a role in the game.
Okay. So mostly in the governance and the rulemaking, and then a little bit in the entrepreneurship. Charles, you've been very generous with your time. I just have two more questions, and these are sort of more big picture questions. The first one is, how optimistic and hopeful are you about the future? This pivot in the global order, somewhat, but not entirely unexpected, and yes, fairly dramatic, change at the speed of light, so to speak. And we're all a little unsettled at the moment, but late in the afternoon, early in the evening, are you sitting back and having some Burgundy and thinking, yeah, you know what, this is an opportunity to actually make the world a better place? Or are you in the basement with the lights dimmed?
Well, Burgundy or Alsace wine might certainly help, but I don't want to frustrate those that appreciate also Bordeaux wine. But I would say no, I'm not very optimistic. And at some point we discussed, what kind of advice we can give also to students that are entering the field today. And I think we're certainly for the coming years, and I mean it's pretty obvious, it's no secrecy to say that there's not going to be any clear pathway in the coming years. We might have moments of stability, but alternating with acute crisis in a world that will remain grounded, in interdependence, and therefore fragile and prone to very rapid crisis propagation, as we've seen with health crisis and pandemic, but also in crisis regarding oil prices, market volatility, etc. At the same time, I would say it also opens the realization for the need for renewed cooperation. Probably, by the way, more at the technical level of cooperation than at the political one. Again, I would refer here, and here maybe it's wishful thinking, but that the functionalist theories that made it very clear, especially at the end of the Second World War, that in order for our contemporary world to actually work and to create stability, cooperation, negotiation, multilateral arrangements were needed. So no, I'm not very hopeful. I would line with those that are expressing warnings after warnings that we need to get more ready for threats, risks to come, for the return of high intensity wars. This is not a widely accepted position in a country like France. When political and military leaders have raised that perspective, it has been very badly received by, let's say, the public opinion. That's why also I'm quite worried of upcoming, elections, including presidential elections in France coming in 2 years, because this might also turn the table in a very different type of scenario. But I still think that the perspective, the role of diplomatic actors, of negotiators, mediators, of course, is still going to remain on the forefront. We see it even with the war, in Iran at the moment. At some point, including during wars, there's a need for negotiation. There's a need to be able to talk to the other.
Well, Charles, let me leave you with, if you could leave our audience with one last perspective, and that is how to think about this paradigm shift that we're witnessing. So not what to think. One of my friends back in the days in Cambridge said, "Okay, Paul, how should I think about the war in Yugoslavia?" And I started to give him my talking points. He's like, "No, don't tell me what to think. Give me a framework so that over the coming year I can process what I'm seeing." So Charles, what framework would you give our listeners about how to think about the challenges that we're facing with this paradigm shift?
Well, if your question is kind of framework that would be useful for decision makers or thinkers about international relations today, and it's difficult to do that, where your question is difficult is that producing a framework is something different than doing recommendations. Because I see where recommendations can be useful in terms of preserving the political and institutional international legacy of the past, 60 to 70 years. But in terms of framework, I'm tempted to see, through because of maybe my academic background, to see it as going through the need to envisage the interaction between multiple type of actors, institutions, and political dynamics. Decision makers' attention should be, you should have the possibility to have access to a framework that deals simultaneously with different type of actors, with different type of political dynamics. We would say, in the conflict resolution field, we would say several tracks, multi-track diplomacy, keeping open the possibility to have an influence at different level and being able to very quickly switch from one type of strategy to another one. And at the same time, and I think that's the difficulty of a framework, is that the debate recently in conflict resolution mediation has been how to go beyond the tracks, how to make the tracks talk among themselves, because that's actually how the reality works on the ground. So I'm sorry that I can't give a definitive answer to that question of framework, and it'll be something that I think about probably after our discussion. But I think one way to say that is that being able to have a framework that evolves very rapidly, very quickly, with the entry point that can have the flexibility, and that relies to, in terms of training, of education, of political approaches, to very quickly switch from one way of action to another one.
Well, that is a trick question, and that's why I save it to the end, Charles.
Thank you so much.
No, and this is, our listeners are struggling with this. It is literally a speed of light that things are changing, and especially our legal listeners and my legal colleagues, rules-based order, customary international law, treaties. Whoa, what is happening in the space of international law? And as you've just noted, in the space of international relations, how international relations are being conducted is changing rapidly. And as you say, having that flexible framework with various points of entry and jumping tracks or weaving the tracks together is crucial. Well, Charles, I wanted to thank you for spending the hour with us. I'm so glad that our listeners have had a chance to experience your thoughts, ideas, and wisdom. I always love our conversations on the margins of our Ukraine working group. I always learn so much, and in particular, what you see in terms of the situation in Ukraine, the European Union, France's role in the world. So I'm glad we were able to dive into some of those questions. So it's been a real honor and a privilege to get to know you these past few years and to have you on the program.
Well, thank you very much for your kind words. It's been a privilege for me too. I see also a way of, it's an illustration of the possibility to confront different worldviews, also cultures, traditions, and that's also a message that we could actually promote, and why not through podcasts and shared discussions. So thank you again for having me. It was a honor too.
Great. Thank you, Charles.